What happens when you're ambitious to an extreme is you begin to sacrifice some of the most important things, such as your prayer life, your Bible reading. You begin to sacrifice fellowship with the right believers. And I think when you do that, that's not self-care. That's reckless ambition. And I would say over my 30 years with Convoy of Hope in the early days, I was so focused on building a ministry that I was sacrificing things that ultimately led to a heart problem.
Hey, welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe because you're going to get great guests like today's guest, Hal Donaldson. You'll also hear from people like Jim Collins, Nona Jones, Sharon McMahon, Andy Stanley, Ed Stetzer, Malcolm Gladwell, and a whole lot more all coming up on this show in the upcoming months. So make sure you hit subscribe, then you won't miss a thing. And today I'm going to sit down with Hal Donaldson. He's the founder and the CEO of Convoy of Hope. We're going to talk about the price of leadership, the cost in particular of neglecting self-care in leadership, and a whole lot more. Today's episode is brought to you by BELAY. So this month is your last opportunity to download BELAY's free resource, 25 Things a Pastor Can Delegate to an Assistant. It's the perfect tool to jumpstart your imagination on all the ways that hiring a virtual assistant can transform your life and leadership. All you have to do is text Carey to 55123. You'll get your free download. That's my name, Carey, to 55123. And today's episode is brought to you by SUBSPLASH. If you feel like you're spending too much time working outside of your wheelhouse, your gifting, and you're expected to be a tech expert, well, join 17,000 other churches that partner with SUBSPLASH for expert tech made simple. Go to subsplash.com/Carey. You'll get $500 off. And now, my conversation with Hal Donaldson. Well, Hal, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast. Known each other for a couple of years, and it's about time.
Hey, thank you for having me, Carey, and congratulations on the podcast. It's having an impact.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a thrill to be able to do it. And I'm really intrigued to dig into your story because you're one of those people that I think once you get to know, you just realize, oh, there's another layer. And there's another layer. And there's one more layer. So I want to start at an experience you had recently because it really rang true with my own leadership and moments that I've had with my wife that have been very bittersweet. So you were at an event, I think it was the grand opening of your distribution center, which is a major accomplishment, big celebration. Everybody flies in, all the employees are there. Supposed to be really a day of happiness, celebration, joy. Yeah. And there was a lot to celebrate. But you said you felt like an embattled warrior. You weren't able to really celebrate and actually felt a ton of regret. So with that said, you're not alone, Hal. And I would love to unpack that with you. What happened in your case on that day?
Yeah, it was the grand opening of our World Distribution Center, which is already helping millions of people. It was several years ago. And it was quite a festive event, huge crowd. And I was sitting on the stage, and all I could think about, Carey, was flashbacks to the sacrifices, to all the travel, the toll that this had taken on me. I mean, we had entered into this facility debt-free. There was no debt. We paid for the whole thing. It was a real miracle. I should have been celebrating one of the great moments of my life. Instead, I just kept looking back, and it was somewhat discouraging and depressing as I regretted some of the things that I had done, such as spending, 150 nights away from home, away from my 4 daughters. And the regrets went on from there. And at the conclusion of the ceremony, one of our longtime donors, partners, asked to speak to me. And a woman in her 80s. And she asked me to come backstage, and just the two of us. And she whispers to me, she said, God wants you to trust him for more. This is not the end. This is the beginning. He has more that he wants to do. And honestly, Carey, it was like a spiritual kick in the rear, that God doesn't want me looking back with regret after regret. He wants me to be focused on the future. And it was just, it was something I needed at the time.
So I want to unpack that because what it brought me back to was 20 years ago, we opened up our first facility. And it was that day. The room was packed. It was a major accomplishment. Everybody was celebrating. I was on the front row with my wife. And I was trying to be happy, but she was crying. And she wasn't crying tears of delight. She was crying tears of bitterness and sadness and resentment because of what that campaign and that project had cost us. And I wasn't nearly as dialed into the regret as I should have been in that season. And we've made a lot of progress in the last 25 years. But man, I mean, when you look back on that, how did God wants you to trust him for more, not just feel like a weight that felt unbearable? Because when we all look back on moments like that, and you talk a lot about it in your latest book, there's a big cost to leadership that is heavy.
There is. There's no question about it. I think for me, I knew God was speaking. And when you have that moment when God is speaking to you, you tend to pay attention. You listen. I knew God was speaking through this woman to me. And on my drive home from that event, I had one of the greatest celebrations of my life. I mean, I was in tears. I was speeding. I was going 90 some odd miles an hour on the freeway without even realizing it. I mean, I was celebrating. The tears were flowing because I knew God had spoken to me. I think there are a lot of your listeners who are going through a real heavy time.
Yeah.
They just need a word from God. They need to know that God is with them. They're not alone. And at that moment, I knew that, yes, it had been an arduous journey, but God had been with me through the entire thing, and he had kept my children safe. I'm a good father. I'm a good husband. My children, my home was intact. I had a lot to be grateful for, and it wasn't time for me to look back. I needed to look forward because there are still millions of people that are lost that need a savior.
So we all have interesting stories. I'm really fascinated by people's origin story, and I've done that hundreds of times on this podcast. But you have a particularly profound, memorable, tragic origin story. And I'd love for you to go back to your childhood and maybe take us back to a couple of pivotal moments early in your childhood related to who you would become.
Yeah, and I'll give you the shorter version, but when I was 12, my parents were scheduled to go to a business meeting, and I was supposed to stay home with my two younger brothers and sister with a babysitter. Babysitter was late. So my dad said, hop in the car, you have to go with us. My dad was halfway down the road, glanced in his rearview mirror, and he spotted the babysitter pulling into our driveway. And so my dad made a U-turn, dropped the four of his kids off. We would spend the night with a babysitter after all. It was about an hour and a half later. There was a knock at our door. I ran to the door, and there standing in front of me were two uniformed police officers. And they had come to deliver the news that our parents had been hit by a drunken driver. My father had been killed instantly. My mother was seriously injured in the hospital fighting for her life. And Carey, I'll never forget that night because I didn't know what was going to happen next. Police officer steps up to the porch. A number of our friends and neighbors had gathered in the front yard, and he addresses the crowd. And he just said, is there anyone here who's willing to take the four children home with them? If not, we'll have to take them downtown to the station. And that night, a young couple, new Christians, raised their hand, and they said, we'll take them. And Bill and Levada Davis, amazing people, took us into their home. Now, all they owned was a single wide trailer. They had children of their own. And so 10 of us lived in a trailer for about a year. These people wrapped their arms around us. They sacrificed their privacy. They drained their savings account so four kids could have a home. So my mom gets out of the hospital. She doesn't have a college degree. She takes on 2 part-time jobs. And so at the age of 12, essentially, I became my mom's business partner and had to take a leadership role in the home. And I have to believe that in those early days, I learned a lot about leadership that really transferred to what I'm doing with Convoy of Hope. And so a very difficult time. Our family didn't have insurance. The man who hit them didn't have insurance. So family on welfare, food stamps, cupboards bare, shoes that have holes in them. But, we experienced the pain, the shame of poverty, but we also experienced the power of kindness because people like the Davises wrapped their arms around us at a local church. They wrapped their arms and said, God has a plan for your life. Bill Davis told me one day, he saw I was hurting and he just said, hey, Hal, don't allow the tragedy of your youth to become a lifelong excuse because where you start in life doesn't have to dictate where you end. That kind of love, that kind of kindness, that kind of care really carried me through up until adulthood.
I've heard that story more than once, and it gets me every time. I just want to say I'm really sorry about what happened to you, to your dad,
Thank you.
to your mom, to your siblings.
Thank you.
How did you process that as a 12-year-old? And then how have you processed that in ensuing decades?
I don't think I processed it very well. I think I wish I had had a counselor. I wish I had had a therapist, a pastor, somebody to talk to. I had a youth pastor, several youth pastors who were amazing, but they weren't professionals. And I was dealing with a lot of really hard questions, God, did you cause my father to die? Did it just happen by chance? Or is there a purpose in all of it? I think it was very difficult for me to process it. And I would say this, I'd go this far. If it wasn't for the kindness of the people in that church, I would have chosen a life of bitterness. But because of their kindness, I believe that God loved me and I believe that God was good. Now, please know there was a lot of questions about injustice. I didn't think it was just that my father was taken. I mean, he was a great man. He was a giving man, very generous. He gave away our car. He gave away our couch. I mean, he was just a very giving person. I thought it was unjust that the man who hit him could walk out of jail 48 hours later with no consequence whatsoever. So as a youth, trying to just process that, saying, God, where are you? Where's the justice in all of this? That was hard. But again, it was the kindness of people in the church, I think, that kept me from really choosing a life of bitterness.
It's funny that you use the term bitterness because we've spent some time together, we've shared a meal or two together, et cetera. And I feel like I've gotten to know you beyond just, an interview. And that was going to be my next question. If there's one word that does not describe Hal Donaldson, it's bitter. And yet I know people who have been through, not that it's a comparison game, but a lot less, take away the air quotes, than you, and are very bitter, are very, that chip on the shoulder that never goes away, the bitterness toward God, the bitterness toward life. What did you do to combat that? You said it was the generosity of the church and the people who took you in, but was it ever a battle? How did you battle back against any bitterness?
I think it's been a lifelong battle.
Yeah.
I don't think you ever get over that. There are some painful experiences that you never get over. You have to continually pray about it, process it. Growing up without a father, and not having a father who could just experience the joyful moments, who could help me through the difficult times. Yeah, that's been tough. And I don't want to candy coat it, and tell you that it hasn't been hard. There have been times that, I've wished my dad was with me. It sure would have made it a lot easier. But so I think it's an ongoing process. But at an early age, I made a decision that God was good. I didn't understand it, all of it. But I believed he was good. And if he's good, then I have to trust him. It's hard at times, but I have to trust him. So I think as a teenager, I decided God is good.
Wow. I was going to ask you, and you may have already answered it, and we can move on. But I imagine that there are more than a couple of listeners who are struggling with bitterness right now for a variety of reasons. Something that happened in their childhood, to their marriage, to a child, to, their leadership. They got fired. They got mistreated. I mean, you and I hear those stories every day.
We do.
If you had advice to people who struggle with bitterness, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what the elderly donor was telling me. Do your best to look in the front, the windshield, and not the rearview mirror. And I have to battle that myself. Everyone does. But God has so many great things in store for you. Keep looking ahead and don't look back. I think for me, it's probably been the fact that I've really surrounded myself with some great people. I think God has done some amazing things in bringing people around me who have helped hold me accountable and give me perspective. And so if you're struggling with bitterness, one thing I would say is make sure you're surrounding yourself with the right people. Don't surround yourself with opportunists, people who tell you what you want to hear. Yeah. Surround yourself with people who are godly people, who pray, who they can speak on behalf of the Lord because they're close to God, and they can speak to you in your time of need.
I'd love to fast forward a couple years, take us into your later teen years as you're thinking about what to do with your life. And, I'm sure at that point you didn't have a lot of advantages. You mentioned welfare, food stamps, a mother who was, I think, chronically ill, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Being taken in by a family who, again, was not a family of means, just a huge heart. Where did that leave you at, your late teens, early 20s as you're making decisions about how you're going to live your life?
Yeah, when you're raised poor, you begin this quest not to be poor anymore. And that certainly was the journey I was on. And I somehow thought the best way to escape poverty and my circumstances was through education. And so I went and earned several degrees, and I began writing books in my 20s. Just incredible doors began to open up for me in my 20s to begin writing books. And one of those books would be a life changer. Some missionaries in Calcutta, India, invited me to come and write their book. And I would end up writing multiple books for them. But on this initial visit to Calcutta, they asked me to interview Mother Teresa for their book. And it was in the course of interviewing Mother Teresa where she just simply asked me, young man, what are you doing to help the poor and the suffering? And I figured I better not lie to her, better tell her the truth, right? And
it's Mother Teresa.
It's Mother Teresa. And so I just said, I'm really not doing much of anything. And she just said, well, everyone can do something. Just do the next kind thing that God puts in front of you. And I went back to my hotel room that night, and honestly, I was feeling ashamed. I was feeling guilty. I was staying in the Oberoi Grand Hotel. It's a 5-star hotel, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place, but surrounded by people of poverty, homeless. And I felt so guilty being there and living in luxury while others were struggling. I came back to the States, and this is probably more than you're asking for, but
no,
I came back I came back to the States, and I was just saying, God, I need to change. My priorities need to change. Yeah. Something has to change in my heart. I've forgotten where I've come from, and I began to pray. What do I do? And I know this sounds a little bit spooky, Carey, but I really felt like God directed me to go get a pencil and a pad, and I wrote down 8 cities. And I felt like God was telling me to travel to 8 cities and to live in the streets for 3 days and 3 nights. I went to Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, DC, New York, major cities. I walked the streets with a hidden tape recorder, interviewing drug addicts and gang members, prostitutes, runaways, the homeless. I rode with the police on the midnight shift. And all I can tell you is that, my heart was broken in the streets of America. And I came back from one of those trips, and I loaded up a pickup truck with groceries, started passing them out to working poor families, migrant farm workers. And that was the start of Convoy of Hope 30 years ago.
My goodness. Okay, so I want to back up. This is fascinating. So education, is the ticket. What were your degrees in? And tell me a little bit more about the books, because you gave something up to start this, and I'm very interested in what you sacrificed to start Convoy.
Yeah. So I was a ghostwriter. So
Okay.
I started at age 23, had my first opportunity to be a ghostwriter, and that was parlayed into multiple book projects. I think I've written over 30 books for people. Yeah, I've done a lot of ghostwriting. And, as a result, it just opened a lot of doors. I met a lot of people, saw a lot of things that someone in their 20s wouldn't. And so
What did you see? What did you see? I'm curious. I feel like I had a similar thing in my 20s.
Yeah, you know what? It was really interesting is that I was rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous.
Yep.
And I could see that they weren't happy. They weren't fulfilled. And what I thought I was striving for in life really wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't what I was looking for. And I saw that in the lives of people who were, multi-millionaires, others who were celebrities, but they didn't seem happy to me. And I saw that in my 20s.
How did those doors open for you in your early 20s? We have a lot of young leaders listening to the show.
Yeah. I know it's a cliche, but God did some things that were miraculous. And I'll just tell you in a nutshell. I was in college, and there was this one man that I was able to help. He and his wife were a young couple in college.
Yeah.
And I had a few extra dollars, and I would keep, passing it their way. And that guy took it upon himself to go to a well-known established writer on my behalf. And he's the one that set up the appointment for me to go and meet with this established writer. That just opened the door. It wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if I had not been generous with this young couple.
Interesting. So that opens the door. You've got multiple titles under your belt.
Yeah.
You're how old when you meet Mother Teresa?
I was 29.
29. Yeah. Okay. So you'd lived through your 20s. You'd had roughly a decade, 8 or 9 years of success.
Yeah.
You're far from poverty at this point because you're making bank. Is that fair?
Yes, that's totally fair. Yep.
Not a lot of people. I think I'll have to Google this after, but I think Mother Teresa and Princess Diana died on the same day. I remember that day, 1997. Really? I could be totally wrong. Start an internet rumor. That. Somebody will correct us, or we'll cut that out. But yeah, she's been gone for a number of years now.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people had an opportunity to meet with her. Can you tell us about that meeting and what she was like? I've heard stories, but I'd love to hear what you discovered about Mother Teresa.
It was a lot different than what I thought. I thought she'd be wearing a halo and, would be glowing. And, I wasn't sure what to expect, but she was so down to earth. At that time, she was having terrible problems with her ankles and feet, and so she was barefoot and she was sliding on the cement. And and we sat down on a bench together, and I wanted to talk about the deep spiritual, theological issues of the day.
Right.
All she wanted to talk about was my family and my wife and my dreams. And she wanted to talk about me. I wanted to talk about her. I'll never forget it.
So it was 6 days apart. I did a quick Google search. So she died in September and Diana died at the end of August of 1997. Anyway. So yeah, I've heard, that her feet were malformed because she always took the smallest shoes, etc. What else did you see about her? So deep curiosity, very practical, not so much philosophical. What kind of practical did you see?
Just the fact that she would be even concerned about my family, my wife, and what my future aspirations were. Here I was with a notepad, wanting to take notes on what she was saying, but there wasn't a lot of note taking. Honestly, it was more her asking me questions.
Wow,
which is impressive. You think about it.
You have a very similar vibe. You don't talk about yourself a lot. You're very interested in other people. Are there any other life lessons you would have pulled from that brief encounter with Mother Teresa?
Yeah, it was interesting is that the missionary couple had started a feeding program. And these were the people that Mother Teresa was working with. And they also left an impression on me. But to see the lack of competition between this missionary couple and Mother Teresa was quite impressive to me. They weren't competitors. They were working together to change just the future of the poor and the suffering. And that's one of the things I took away is we're not in competition. We're on the same team. That was quite impressive as well.
So you're 29 years old. This changes your life. You go live on the streets for 3 days and 3 nights in 8 major cities, and you start this spectacular organization called Convoy of Hope, which sounds like a nice idea, but the scale is exceptional. As I've gotten to know what you do, it's blown me away.
Thank you.
How did those first 3 decades, the lessons you learned as a young man, a young leader, set you up for running an organization with the footprint and the size and the scale and the impact of a Convoy of Hope?
Yeah, I think I was probably I didn't have some master plan. I'm actually grateful that God didn't show me where this was headed, because it would have freaked me out.
Would have been overwhelming. Yeah,
it would have been. Yeah. So, I believe vision is incremental, and God has just really shown me the next step, shown our team the next step, and we've been obedient to that next step. And although we have some audacious goals, feeding 1 million children a day, et cetera, et cetera. It's still about just following the next step. That has not changed with Convoy. So I'd have to say, Carey, I've kind of grown up with it, step by step.
So you write in your latest book a lot about self-care and ambition, et cetera. And somebody listening to this interview, very casual, very relaxed, very focused, but there's a drive underneath all of that.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit how you've had to wrestle down, for better or for worse, that drive and ambition that you felt throughout your life, Hal.
Yeah, I think because of what I was doing, helping the poor and the suffering, I thought that I was inoculated from the consequences of a busy life. I thought that, lack of sleep, lack of nutrition, lack of exercise wouldn't catch up on me because I was doing the Lord's work, and that certainly wasn't the case. And, that would come back to haunt me with a health scare at some point. And, so I think, Carey, in the early days, I wouldn't call my ambition reckless. It wasn't reckless ambition. It was a desire to do the Lord's work, just do the Lord's work and to take advantage of every opportunity He could give me. And, I guess I learned that probably self-care is a partnership between me and God. I have to do my part, and then, He does His, but it's a partnership. And I guess I discovered too that self-care is not selfishness. For a long time, I thought it was, but it's actually selflessness. Because the more we take care of ourselves, that means that we're not operating from a point of deficit.
Yeah.
And, I think for many years, I was operating from a position of deficit that was really affecting my effectiveness. So, yeah, that part has been a journey for sure.
Yeah. What kept you running for a long time? I mean, a lot of us and ambition, sometimes it gets out of control, or drive that gets a little bit out of control. It's been part of my story too, right? Almost 20 years ago, I burned out, and that was a very kind, in retrospect, wake-up call in that my life didn't fall apart. I could put it back together again pretty easily, but it was abrupt. So what kind of price did you pay let's start there. What kind of price did you pay? What did you cheat, so to speak, to use Andy Stanley's language, and what was the cost?
I think that living on 5 hours a night of sleep, not really watching nutritionally what I was eating, because again, you're traveling the world.
Yes.
And, it's not like you can really govern what you eat, and you're in some very desperate places. I think just living on the road was a big part of it. And, for me, I think it ended at the age of 50. I had what I thought was a kidney stone. Actually, what it was my heart. And they had to put 2 stents in my heart. And, that was a real eye-opener for me. When I got out of the hospital, I began asking a really important question that I should have been asking in my 20s. God, where do you need me most? Where do you need me most? Because what I was doing was essentially, I was writing multiple books. I was the editor of an international magazine, and I was managing Convoy. Then trying to be a father and a husband too, And when I asked that question, the Lord answered me, and it was Hal, I need you to give your full attention to Convoy of Hope. And I have to say that when I made that decision, things began to soar. When I wasn't divided, they began to soar.
One of the challenges, I think, of a friend of mine who says the problem with needs-based ministry is there's no end to human need.
Yes.
And you must find that. I mean,
yes.
Your organization has a huge impact. So do a lot of other nonprofits. But even for a local church or a local business, that's an impact type business. It's like, well, we could do this, or we could open up another one, or we could do this, or there's more people to reach. There's more people to feed, more people to close, more women to empower, et cetera, et cetera. That could lead to a 24/7 culture where you never sleep, where you never take care of yourself. How do you draw the line between we're going to do this project and we're not going to do that project yet, or perhaps ever?
What you hit on is like the most difficult question that I face. Yeah. Especially like when you're being bombarded with needs from around the world and across the United States.
Yeah.
And you know that your yes could mean someone's survival, and your no could mean just the opposite. So, I found often, as leaders, we're torn between what we feel is our duty to God and our personal desires, right? I mean, that's part of leadership. You're torn. And I think one of the things that helped me a lot was the fact that Jesus was surrounded by needs everywhere he went. Every single day, he was confronted with needs. He didn't heal everyone. He didn't feed everyone.
Yeah.
What he did was he did what his Father asked him to do. And I think when I began to understand the prayer component and the importance of praying and asking God what he would have us do, things began to become a lot more clear. And, as a younger leader, I wish I had prayed more and worked less. I really do. And as a young leader, I thought if I saw the need, if I heard the need, automatically my job is to meet that need. Yeah. And I was running all over the world trying to meet needs. And, I came to the realization, no, I just need to begin with prayer. Yeah. Is that something you want me to do?
How do you even discern that? Because I think we've all prayed hoping we get an answer. And let's make that really practical, all right? One of the things, Convoy does so many different things, but one of the things you'll do is if there's, let's pick a tornado. Okay, so there's a tornado, but sometimes a tornado will sweep through the Midwest and hit 10 different cities, or a series of tornadoes does.
Yes.
You've got the resources to respond to 5.
Yes.
Hypothetically, what does that discernment process look like? Because you can't help everybody.
Yeah, it certainly begins with existing relationships. Okay, and everything Convoy of Hope does is connected through the local church. God raised up Convoy of Hope to resource and activate the local church. And so that's where it begins for us, existing relationships. And that doesn't mean that we won't help or work with a relationship we don't have. It just means we begin with a church that we know. And why is that important? It's because our job is not to lift up the name of Convoy of Hope. It's really to elevate the local church and to exalt the name of Jesus. And that's really our job. And let's say a disaster, for example, there'll come a day when Convoy's trucks leave, but that church will remain. And to have a long-term impact on the kingdom, you need to elevate the church. The church needs to be out front. And so that's really where we begin, Carey. But any given time, we may be in 12, 15 different locations. It's especially this year with all the tornadoes. It's been a very busy year.
So when you're praying, what do you listen for?
Yeah, there are several things. And I think I've shared this with you privately. Yeah. For years, I've written notes to God.
Yeah.
And you're right. I take a little neat piece of paper or an envelope, whatever, and I'll write a question or a need, and I'll stick it in my wallet, in my Bible, in my briefcase. So a lot of times it's a God answering questions I'm already asking, and where there's clarity. I'm asking the question, I don't have clarity, but all of a sudden I got clarity. And I discovered that God's a good reader. He's a great reader, right? I've got notes in my wallet right now of things that I'm asking God questions. And God answers when there's a moment of clarity. It's not a voice, but it's just a moment of clarity. Like, yes, that's the way to go. Again, coming back to what I said before, it's like the next step, showing us the next step.
Can you give us an example of a note and an answer?
Yeah. Like, for example, the property where we bought 240 acres of land to build this beautiful campus it's helping millions of people around the world and really serving the church. I wrote it and I put it in my wallet, put a note in my wallet that says, God, show us the land. And so we went to one piece of land and I thought, okay, maybe it's right, but there wasn't the clarity that we needed. We went to another piece of land. I went before the board of directors. I said, hey, we can't find anything else other than this piece of land. It's really expensive. It's a great piece of land. I think it's God's will, but I really didn't know. And then literally, Carey, I walked onto this piece of land, 240 acres, and it was instant clarity. Like, this is the holy ground. This is the place that I want to build and establish this work that's going to touch the world. But it began with writing a note and asking God, where do you want us to go?
This is a really interesting perspective. I hadn't quite heard that take on prayer, but it's a way of kind of continually praying, right? So
yes,
it's a way of leaving the file open until you have the clarity that we often seek. Because often we'll pray in the morning, expect an answer by noon. Maybe it doesn't always work that way. Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
That's super wise. How is your life different today as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Like, what are some of the differences that you notice?
Yeah, 20 years ago, as I said, I was writing books. I was editor of an international magazine. I was doing Convoy, and had the health scare. And that was a busy life. That was not a godly or Christ honoring life. That was just a busy life, trying to do too much. 10 years ago, Convoy was gaining momentum. And, whenever a ministry, a church is gaining momentum, there will be opposition. Hardship is inevitable. It's not if it comes, it's when it comes. And in our case, my wife and I were extremely disappointed by and disillusioned by just the actions of some people who were working with us, and we felt really let down. And I remember going to a board of directors meeting, and the board could see that I just wasn't myself. And in that board meeting, they really encouraged my wife and I to sit with a counselor and try to process this disillusionment and disappointment. And so we did for the first time in our lives. And all I can tell you is that moment, that first meeting, was therapeutic. It was life-changing. The major takeaways was that I wasn't alone, that Jesus was betrayed by Judas. God the Father was betrayed by Lucifer, and I wasn't alone. And that Jesus faced betrayal and criticism, and he faced the expectations of people, and that really for the first time, again, coming back to my childhood, where, I'm like almost the head of a household at the age of 12, that I wasn't responsible for other people's stuff, their actions, their behavior, their attitudes, their character flaws. I wasn't responsible for that. And I think 10 years ago, I learned my limitations. I learned that you have to entrust more to God. And 10 years ago, I really got my heart in a place that God could build upon. My closeness with God, it reached a whole new pinnacle, a new level. And, I believe the heart is the foundation that God builds a ministry or a church upon. I think 10 years ago plus, I got my heart in a place where I was really honoring the Lord with everything I did. I'm not a saint. I'm not a superstar. But I got my heart in a place that God could build upon. And Convoy just began to go to new levels when the heart was right, when the heart wasn't flawed. And I say that with tears in my eyes because, for many years, I was more reliant on my ability than I was on God's. And it's when the heart is right, God can build. And we learned that lesson at Convoy.
What is the difference between relying on your own ability and relying on God from where you sit?
Yeah, I think it's going beyond reasonable behavior. There are some ministers, there are some leaders who, if they're not working 110%, they feel like they're disappointing God. Yeah. And we have to ignore the lies of the enemy. Those are lies. And it just leads to reckless ambition. And, I think for me, I was just going to extremes. I was making sacrifices that God wasn't asking me to make. And it paid a toll.
So is it like better self-care then, et cetera?
I think it's better self-care, but I think it's also what happens when you're ambitious to an extreme is you begin to sacrifice some of the most important things, such as your prayer life, your Bible reading. You begin to sacrifice fellowship with the right believers. And I think when you do that, that's not self-care. That's reckless ambition. And I would say over my 30 years with Convoy of Hope in the early days, I was so focused on building a ministry that I was sacrificing things that ultimately led to a heart problem.
What is the biggest difference day to day since you made that pivot?
I think relying on other people more. I think a better delegator. I think surrounding yourself with quality people who you can entrust. The people who are running these cameras, they can run the cameras. I don't need to run the cameras. I think that's a big part of it. It's just
was there a day when you would try to do that or try to orchestrate?
Yeah, I would try to tell them what to do. I would try to play the role of super director, and producer. Some years ago, I learned the lesson. No, they need to tell me. They're the experts. And I think that's one of the things that's changed is that I've become a better delegator. And, we have a massive team, and you better delegate because God's given us a big work to do.
I think you wrote you try to discipline yourself not to entertain weighty topics after 8 p.m.
Yeah.
Never heard that discipline, really intrigued by it. Can you give us the origin and then how on earth you do that? You talk to so many leaders, they're like, yeah, the reason I couldn't sleep last night, it just kept ruminating in my head and I was up till midnight even though I was in bed. How do you train yourself not to entertain weighty subjects after 8 p.m.?
Well, I learned the hard way. I learned because I was the one that was lying awake after midnight. And, but I guess I told myself, I don't think I heard it from anybody, but I told myself, hey, when I do that, I'm cheating tomorrow. I'm waking up with less hours sleep and I'm not going to be as productive. And I need to practice holy procrastination. And that's put things off until tomorrow. Let tomorrow, I think there's something biblical about that. Let's worry about tomorrow. And I began to just, I guess maybe from an understanding that how I was operating, I was cheating tomorrow because I was lying awake so many nights.
I mean, that's great, but I talk to a lot of people. I'm not one of those people, but I talk to a lot of people who are like, yeah, but I just can't turn it off. How did you turn it off? How do you shut down after 8 o'clock? Because you're literally dealing with life and death, multi-million-dollar decisions, global crises, probably your own share of personnel issues, which are always the worst for me. Yeah. How do you just turn the faucet off at 8 o'clock and open it up again in the morning?
I think it's a gift from God. I do. Yeah. I think it's a gift. I think I prayed, I said, God, help me do this. And he has. Come 7:30, 8 o'clock, I'm not thinking about the worries of tomorrow and all the worries that go along with my position. I'm focused on my family and doing things I like to do.
Do you have a routine? I was going to say, did you change your routine at all? Was there any tangible changes you've made?
Yeah, I think the nighttime is my wife's time and my kids' time. And so I used to schedule breakfast, lunch, and dinner meetings. 5 days a week.
Wow.
So here's something practical I did was I stopped scheduling dinner meetings. No more. There's probably some examples of where I have, but I move everything to lunch or breakfast. And that's helped keep my evenings free to do what I need to do to stay refreshed and stay encouraged.
Did you have any hobbies before you made this change? And if so, have you added some in after?
Yeah, you know what? I am a big sports fanatic. And I really enjoy sports of all kinds. And so, I pay attention. I read I read ESPN. I do pay attention to sports. And I think along the same time as this change, I started playing fantasy football and fantasy sports. And people are surprised to hear me say that, but I'm not ashamed of it. It's a good distraction.
Hey, you got to pick your poisons, right? That's the way I look at it. It's like, what are you going to do? And if it illustrates another principle I've been thinking about a lot, because I'm with you. I was terrible at this for years, and it was my grown kids who challenged me. And I found I really had to spend years cultivating a life outside of work so that I have something to look forward to, because I really enjoy this. 9 days out of 10 are good days for me. You know what I mean?
Yes,
they're not easy days, but they're good days. It's like I'm really thankful I get to do it. And so, tonight my wife and I are going for a bike ride. We're going to do a sunset ride. I get to mow my lawn, which actually I enjoy, unlike most people. I really enjoy that. That's a hobby thing for me. And I have other things that I do. We go boating. We live near a lake. But I had to fill the void, because if there's a void, what am I going to do? I'm going to work. I'm going to ruminate.
Yes.
I'm going to open up the laptop. I'm going to do all those things. Similar or different for you, Hal?
Yeah, I do like to write, and I like to read. And, I have a journal, so I write in my journal every day. And I write it, longhand, print it out, but in a journal book, because I want to pass that on to my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And, so I've been doing that now for 12 years. And so that's, when you talk about routine, that's something I do every night and it's not just spiritual truths. Sometimes it's about just the joy of life and that sort of thing. But I think that was a big life change. And then, another practice that I made with my wife is that we made vacations sacred. And so, like at the beginning of the year, we would schedule vacations, schedule the time, and our kids knew that there was nothing that was going to interfere with those vacations or the time away. I remember one time I received an invitation to go to the Oval Office with 5 other ministers, and I declined because it was during a time that I was supposed to be with my girls, my wife. And
Wow.
so I think that's one of the steps that we took that was really wise, as making vacations and time away sacred.
I imagine that would be really difficult to do in your view, White House notwithstanding. But because disasters hit 365 days a year, and so there can be a temptation. I'd love to know, if you think about your coworkers who have worked with you for, say, 20 years, what is the biggest difference they notice between then and now?
I'm more, I probably am a little bit more reluctant to make quick decisions. I usually don't have a problem with saying, let's sleep on it. Let's talk tomorrow, because, that's, God can give you clarity in 24 hours. And so I think they would say that I used to be, just willing to make decisions on a dime. Now I'm probably a little bit more restrained, and in making sure that we make godly decisions. I think that's what they would say.
It's interesting. I not only read your book, I read your latest annual report. And when I look at the growth of Convoy, both financially and in terms of impact, there's steady growth over the decades, but lately there's been hockey stick growth. Just hugely in the last 5 years, Hal?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Are the changes you've made somehow also related to the growth that Convoy has experienced? Do you know?
Yeah, I think part of it is timing. I think for years we've been faithful, we've been hardworking, and I think because of our commitment to the church, I think the church is poised. The church is poised to respond like never before to physical and spiritual needs. Our reason for being is to resource and activate churches and mobilize people to help the poor and the suffering, or help those who are stricken by disaster. I think it's a timing factor. It's probably over the last 12, 13 years that we have seen incredible growth at about 20% a year. And the reason for it, I would go back to, is 12, 13 years ago, we made a solid commitment to the church that we weren't going to throw food off the back of a truck. No, we're going to work with churches. And when we made that decision, everything just really began to change. But I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the church is poised. We're no longer having to convince churches to help the poor and the suffering. They want to. They just want a track to run on.
Yeah, and you're that track. Interesting. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth. A mutual friend, Craig Rochelle, I think Craig's been on this podcast numerous times. You know Craig really well. Yep. And, I think he would probably say, as he's been very public about the changes in his leadership over the years, that him stepping back, getting healthier. I mean, the guy is still dialed in, Craig, as well as anybody. I mean,
right.
You look up dialed in and there is a picture of Craig in the dictionary, right? So he's dialed in, but he's also learned to step back. He's also learned to trust his team. He's also gotten healthy, as you are prioritizing. And when you see that, you also see the exponential growth of Life Church. So I wonder if there's a parallel there. I also wonder, along, as Eugene Peterson said, who I think was quoting Kierkegaard, a long obedience in the same direction. You didn't start Convoy yesterday. This is, did you say 30 years?
30 years, yeah.
30 years. So you have long obedience, same direction, and the benefit of compound interest, right? If you want to pull from Warren Buffett. Do you want to talk about long-term fruit to leaders? Again, remembering we've got a lot of older leaders who are hanging in there, a lot of younger leaders who like, I got 3 years under my belt. How come this thing hasn't blown up yet, Hal? Help me understand.
Yeah. Well, I think I can only speak from our experience. And when we made a decision that we wanted to be used by God as a catalyst for a movement rather than just building another charity, when we made that decision, things began to change. And again, I think that's God setting course. It's God setting priorities. And so how we grow, how we scale, it's not our first question. It's our first question is God, are you asking us to do this? A lot of times we've done things that God wasn't asking us to do, but are we doing what God's asking us to do? And two, how is this going to benefit the local church? If it's not going to benefit the local church, then why are we doing it? And there are some great things that we have walked away from, tremendous opportunities, just because there was no church connection. It was about bringing attention to us, and that's not what we're about. We're about lifting up and exalting the local church.
I mean this in the kindest way. You're one of the largest charities most even Christian leaders have never heard of. And because you work in the background, because you quietly, I would suggest humbly, go about it. One of the things that really interested me, I'm always interested in counterintuitive decisions. And you've said this publicly. If you need to nuance it because I got it wrong or didn't write my notes properly, please nuance it all you want. But you administer hundreds of millions of dollars of relief a year in kind and cash, right?
Right.
So tornado hits, your truck rolls in, you partner with a local church, you're there with water, food, sanitary, you name it, you've got it. Usually the first in, and you want to be the last to leave of all the relief organizations. And so that's how you partner with the local church. There's a lot of other facets. But you don't keep a huge reserve in the bank account. You tend to administer the relief as it comes in. Can you explain the thinking behind that? Because most people would say, wow, if you had $100 million in the bank, imagine what you could do. And you're like, no, you don't quite run on fumes. Like you've got cash flow, but you're not stockpiling cash.
No, I mean, we have reserves to operate the organization, but what we don't do is stow away funds for specific disasters. Because if you're going to do that, you're going to be sowing away tens of millions of dollars. I mean, God has directed us not to budget for specific disasters. We believe that if we're exalting the name of Jesus, again, elevating the local church, that God will pay the bill. It's not the safest model, but it's worked for us. It's worked for us. We've seen God do so many amazing things. And we've been the recipients of the generosity of churches and businesses and individuals. Every time we put the word out that we're responding, we've seen people respond in kind with generosity. And I think there's another factor too, is that in the early days in particular, we didn't want our relief teams focusing on money. No, your job, go and meet needs. Just meet needs. We'll worry about the money later. God will provide. Just do the work of Jesus. He will provide. And for over 20 years, he has.
How does that work out practically? Because you sometimes make the decision to go into a community, respond to a war before those resources are in place. So can you walk us through how that might play out day to day?
Yeah, I think part of it is when you've been at it so long, you can really kind of guess what's going to come in the way of donations. So I don't want to spiritualize it too much, but it is a faith walk. When you're writing $1 million checks, for Ukraine, for example, or Katrina, or the tornadoes. You're writing big checks. It's a step of faith. You're believing that God is going to come, honor his word, and come behind and provide. And we've just been at it so long that it's second nature to us. Really is.
When you think about your development as a leader over the last 3 decades at Convoy, what has been one of the hardest pivots for you to make? It could be letting go of control. It could be something that we haven't talked about yet. But when you think about, of all the leadership challenges you've had, which has been the hardest corner to turn for you?
I don't know that I've even thought about it. Let me a second here.
Yeah, take your time.
I think pivot in terms of delegation. I mentioned that earlier, delegating more. I think, I didn't feel called initially to do international work. It was really U.S. work. And for the first 5 years or so, it was just U.S. based. We were doing community outreaches alone. We started responding to disasters, but I was in Africa, and the photographer that was with me said, I was there writing a book, and photographer says to me, "Hey, I think Convoy can make a real difference here." And I really thought and prayed about it, and that was quite a day when I came back and said, we're going to start doing an international work. I think people looked around like I was out of my mind, but there have been steps like that with Katrina, with where we did like 1,000 truckloads. We started with a desire to do 100, ended up being 1,000. Again, pivoting forward, like we're going to do a lot more with the pandemic. I said, let's distribute 10 million meals. I went on camera and said, we're going to distribute 10 million meals. Well, God pushed us to provide over 200 million meals, over 200 million meals.
Wow.
And so a lot of times the pivot is pivoting forward. My faith is lacking, and God shows that he wants to do more. I would say there have been many examples of that, or my faith has been less than God's provision.
Hal, I don't even know how to how to phrase this, and I don't know that you're able to answer it well because of the nature of the question. But often when you think about the growth and the scale of what Convoy is doing, you meet CEOs, you meet leaders, even nonprofit leaders, and there's a healthy ego there. There's a sense of big, or look at what we're doing next. In my time with you, it's the opposite vibe. If it would be like, if you're in a room with 100 leaders, it's like, spot the CEO here of Convoy. Most people would be like, okay, we're down to 9. It's like David going, it's like Samuel going through all the sons of David, and all of a sudden, or sons of Jesse, and all of a sudden, I got one more, he's out in the field. And I don't mean that I mean that as a compliment.
No, I think you're right.
There's a culture of humility, and it starts with you. And I think it's sorely lacking in the church. Again, I don't know that you can answer this, how you would answer this, but I would love for you to reflect on, is that something you've cultivated over the years? Is it something that you were born with? And any other comments you might have for leaders, because I think it's very needed in the church and also in my life.
Well, I think, in my book, I talk a lot about the fact that compassion work, in particular, even pastoral work, can lead to pride, because you begin to tell yourself, I care more than others care. And you begin to count the sacrifices you're making, and you feel so noble and so high and mighty because you're doing so much and others aren't doing enough. And I'm sure many face that. And I think for me, I'm well aware of my flaws and my weaknesses. I think God, for whatever reason, has chosen, in spite of my weaknesses, to just work through. And I guess at some point I came to the realization that it's Jesus loving the world through us. It's not us. We're just channels of his love to other people, and Our job is keep the channel open. A lot of times through pride and selfishness, we close that channel and you can only do so much. We got to keep it open. And I think when you understand that, you're more inclined not to touch the glory or to fall prey to pride. You really are when you understand you're a channel, period.
Hal, we covered a lot. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to touch on before we wrap up?
I just, this isn't what you're asking for, but I want to thank you for the way that you are serving the church. You really are. You're meeting a need. And to all my brothers and sisters out there that maybe are going through a struggling time right now, they're struggling, they're hurting, going through hardship. Just know this, that one hardship is the beginning of God's next miracle. God is going to provide you with miracles. You've heard me, I think, say this before. I believe it's very linear. It's hardship followed by miracles, hardship followed by miracles. You're going through a hard time right now. A miracle's coming. Believe it.
Oh, we've seen that again and again in your life. So Hal's latest book is called What Really Matters. It's a great read. It's available everywhere. Where can people track with you and Convoy online, Hal?
Yeah, it's simply convoyofhope.org. And if they write us, we'll respond for sure.
You sure do. Hal, thank you so much. It is really inspiring to see your leadership. Just love that spirit you bring to the work that you're called to do. And I'm absolutely delighted we've been able to spend some time together in the presence of all these leaders.
It's great to get to know you, Carey. Really.